Hi everyone. Just so everyone is aware, we are recording this session and the recording has already started. Firstly, I want to introduce myself. My name's Danielle Lyons. I work with Spinks, who are talent partners to the tech startup community in the UK. And we are also event organisers with Computer Weekly. Welcome to the first of our diversity and inclusion workshops. This is the first of 3 workshops leading up to the main conference on the 1st of October. If you haven't registered yet, please do, and we will be forwarding around links to register your attendance in the conference on the 1st of October. Now, without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce you to Rachel Morgan-Trimmer, Neurodiversity Consultant from Sparkle Class. Rachel, welcome, and thank you so much.
Thank you very much for inviting me, Dania. Thank you all very much for coming to my workshop. Now, when you signed up, you will have received an email which had a very specific task you had to complete before today's workshop. And I was very specific in that email that if not all of you completed it, none of this workshop will work. Now, how are you feeling? Confused? Maybe worried or anxious? Perhaps like you're in trouble? Or maybe like you've let everybody down? There wasn't really an email. I just pretended there was, so you would understand how it feels to be a neurodiverse person, because that's the way we feel every day. So I'm going to start my workshop now. I am going to share my screen. So today's workshop is what is neurodiversity and why should you care about it? Today's workshop is all about you. So I want you to feel comfortable. I have chosen this picture of a baby hedgehog to represent you today because I know we all can be a little bit spiky on the outside, but we're all quite soft on the inside. So I want you to feel comfortable. I want you to be comfortable asking questions during the workshop. If there's anything you don't understand or you need me to repeat anything, there's a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. So you can use that. I can't see it myself, but if you want to pop a question in there, Daniel will interrupt me and ask that question on your behalf. Okay. So first of all, who am I? Who am I to be telling you all about neurodiversity? Well, I'm a neurodiversity consultant, and that means I go into companies, I train their staff on how to be inclusive to neurodiverse people, staff and clients, and I do training workshops and consultancy and help with recruitment and so on. And I help individuals as well. I help those neurodiverse individuals with managing their work and so on. And I am neurodiverse myself. I have ADHD and I'm also autistic. My company is called Sparkle Class and I'm a member of the Neurodiversity Association. So, what is neurodiversity exactly? Neurodiversity is the name given to a group of conditions, and those conditions are all characterized by a brain difference. Some of them you will have heard of, and we're going to talk about 4 of them today. These are dyslexia, dyspraxia, ADHD, which is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and autism. So I'm going to go over each of those in turn to help you get a grip on, understanding exactly what these conditions involve. Now, every neurodiverse person is different. Every dyslexic you meet, every dyspraxic and so on, everybody has a different amount of each of the characteristics that you might find in each of those individuals. And we do tend to have the different characteristics in a greater or lesser extent. So this is very much a generalization, and some of these things you'll see a lot of and some of them not so much. So, but it will give you a really good idea of what these conditions involve. Here's a recipe for a Victoria sponge. Now I'd like you to try and read it. It's quite hard, isn't it? Because there's sort of spaces everywhere. It's not been laid out very well. And there's no real simulation for dyslexia, but this does give you an idea of how it can be difficult to read if you have dyslexia. But there's something else. I would like you to try to move away from your screen. Just move back from your screen. You might have to get out of your chair for this. Move away from your screen and see if you can see a shape hidden in that recipe. If anyone's dyslexic, they probably would have got it already. There's a fish hidden in it. That's how dyslexics see. They see the shape. And a lot of them will have seen that before they've read any of the words. So dyslexia is characterized by seeing in shapes rather than detail. Let's look at some more of those characteristics. So dyslexia is characterized by challenges with reading and writing and spelling. That's universal. It doesn't mean that dyslexics can't read, because many of them can. Many of them write quite well, and many of them can spell quite well, but they will have all had challenges with that. They have difficulty things order right getting in there. They can read words like this more easily. Now in this sentence, I have put the first letter and the last letter of each word in the right place, but the letters in the middle are all muddled up. A lot of dyslexics read like that anyway. So when you have a sentence written like this, they can actually read it more easily than a person without dyslexia. Dyslexics are creative and they are insightful. You find a lot of creatives in jobs like architecture and in graphic design, because they're very good at seeing in shapes and seeing in 3D, and also in spotting patterns, looking at gaps and spotting anomalies and so on. Some dyslexics are poor. Some don't ever have the opportunities that people without dyslexia have, because they don't ever get through the school system very well. We live in a world of words, and if you can't get through that, you will often not have the same kinds of opportunities. There's some correlations, for example, with dyslexia and homelessness, but that is in no way universal, because some dyslexics are loaded. Chief Executive magazine found that 25% of British CEOs have dyslexia. And the BBC found that 40% of UK self-made millionaires have dyslexia. Now I know what you're thinking. You're thinking maybe you would like one of these dyslexics for your next partner. And if you do, I have a word of warning for you. They won't text you back. There's two reasons for that. One of them is that it takes a lot of dyslexics quite a bit longer to actually write a text. So you might think it's just, you know, a couple of minutes or whatever, but if it's going to take them longer, sometimes they won't get around to it. And one of the other problems is that they quite often feel embarrassed if their spelling's not very good, and they fear that you're going to judge them. So some dyslexics will avoid writing or texting or sending an email because of that. Did we have a raised hand, Anya?
In error, by mistake.
Okay. So that's dyslexia anyway. Would you like to do some origami? If you've got a pen and paper there, grab your pen and paper. And what I would like you to do is I would like you to write the word crane on your bit of paper, but I would like you to write it with your non-dominant hand. That's a hand you don't normally use for writing. So if you can write crane on your bit of paper with your non-dominant hand, it's probably going to be the left hand for most of you. And when you've done that, I would like you to fold your bit of paper into this crane. Are you waiting for me to put the instructions up on this slide? Because that's not going to happen. This is kind of a simulation of what it's like to be dyspraxic, because as well as having trouble with fine motor movements like writing, being able to do something like fold a crane out of paper is quite difficult when you don't have the steps, when you're not given step-by-step instructions and you're not given the sequence of how to do things. Dyspraxia is characterized by a disconnect between the brain and the body. So let's have a look at some of the characteristics of dyspraxia. So as we've seen, It's characterized by difficulty with fine and or gross motor movements. So that was like you had with trying to write crane with your non-dominant hand. Something like that would be characteristic. Like we saw with the origami crane, dyspraxics need sequences and steps laid out very clearly in order for them to complete a task. That's a weird one. They can't advertise women's sanitary products. Now, why is that? You know, the ads for those things, they've always got somebody riding a horse or going swimming or doing some mountain climbing or going dancing. Those are all things that dyspraxics struggle with. But there's a plus side, because if you're dyspraxic, it is easy to feel like you're in a romantic comedy. And that's because dyspraxics have a tendency to bump into things. So you know those comedies where, you know, the woman's, she bumps into the man, she's the adorable clerk, she bumps into the guy and drops her papers and they pick them up and they get, you know, the sort of scenario you get in a romantic comedy. Or like in, is it Bridget Jones's Diary, when she cooks that terrible meal with the blue soup? Some dyspraxics have trouble cooking because of the sequence of steps involved. So yeah, if you're dyspraxic, you can pretend you're in a romantic comedy. Like a lot of neurodiverse people, dyspraxics are creative problem solvers. Because it's difficult for them to do things that other people don't have trouble with, they quite often need to find a way around those problems. They're very good at persevering. Those things that I mentioned earlier, like swimming and riding a bike or whatever, a lot of dyspraxics do learn them, but one thing I hear a lot of is that they did do it, but they learned quite a bit later than their peers, which is not an easy thing to do, you know, learning to swim late or ride a bike late or learn to write properly a little bit later than everyone else. They do tend to persevere, and that's one of their key strengths. Dyspraxics tend to have poor proprioception. Proprioception is the sense of where your body is in the space. Now, if you were to reach your hand out towards your screen right now, you can probably, if you don't have dyspraxia, you can stop before you get to the screen. You know where your hand ends and where your screen begins. But a dyspraxic person might have trouble with that and therefore get mucky fingerprints on their screen. And the last thing on my list is they have trouble saying stuff like poor proprioception, because sometimes it affects the mouth, so it can affect how you speak as well. So that's dyspraxia. Would you like to play a little memory game? Dania, are you okay describing it? If you can't see the what's coming up on my screen, Dania's going to describe it for you in words, and I'm going to show you some short videos, and I would like you to either write down or just memorize what you can see.
So I can see a grey cat, and now I can see a dog with a butterfly on his nose.
Okay, thank you, Dania. So everybody got that right? There was a grey stripy cat falling asleep, then there was a baby with a balloon, and then there was a dog with a butterfly on its nose. Did everybody get that? You didn't, because that wasn't really a memory game. That was a simulation of what it's like to have ADHD. There wasn't a baby with a balloon in the middle. But this is an example of how it feels to have ADHD when you can't remember what you've just seen always. And it's based on a real example. It's actually based on something that happened to me a few months ago at a training course. It was, ironically enough, it was a listening course. And obviously it was a massive challenge for me because of my ADHD. And what happened was, we were sitting there and he showed us 2 videos of people talking. And then afterwards, he asked the class what happened in the first video. And I never join in things like this because I haven't really been paying that much attention. So I don't really know. And everyone else was saying this happened and that happened. And I'm like, yeah. And then what was in the second video, and the class said this happened and that happened. And then he said, what was in the third video? And I thought to myself, he's tricking us because there are only 2 videos. And then suddenly people in the rest of the class are going, oh, this happened and that happened. And I was like, hang on a sec. Were there 3 videos? And I had just seen them and already forgotten. And that's how extreme ADHD can be. It's not just that you forget stuff, it's that you don't realize that you've forgotten it. ADHD stands for Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder. It's very, very hard to sum up in one sentence like I've done with the other conditions. So I'm going to use what I used to describe myself, which is being a space cadet. And it's also an excuse to show you my lovely t-shirt, which says on it, Official Space Cadet. It's one of those things that people used to hurl at me as an insult, and that I just eventually took on board and said, yeah, I actually quite like being a space cadet. So let's look at ADHD in a little bit more detail. There are actually, that's a bit weird, actually two types of ADHD, type 1 and type 2. Type 1 is the one you're probably most familiar with, and that's the stereotypical little boy in class, won't sit still, always jumping around and so on. Type 2 is the inattentive kind, and that's the daydreamer kind. That's the kind I have, and it's actually more common in women than in men. And actually some people have both types. You can have both at the same time. ADHD is characterized by being forgetful. We are easily distracted. So while I am doing this presentation, I am very much hoping that Frank from the end of my road doesn't walk down the street holding something weird, which he quite often does, because that's going to put me off a little bit. We are forgetful. We are messy. That's very, very common with people with ADHD. It doesn't affect our whole lives because a lot of us will try and bring some order to the chaos. So you can see my shelves behind me are actually quite tidy for that reason, because otherwise I wouldn't find anything. It's a jolly good thing that you can't see the floor, because that is an absolute tip. We are creative, again, like a lot of neurodiverse people. We are very creative. We have a billion ideas all the time. We're always coming up with new ideas, new ways of doing things, new projects that we want to get started with, all kinds of stuff. We're inconsistent. We can hyperfocus. This is something that a lot of people don't realize about ADHD. If we're interested in something, we can focus on it to the exclusion of anything else. We can get a lot done if we're able to enter that state of flow. And if you interrupt somebody with ADHD while they're in a state of hyperfocus, they will probably get quite angry with you. We're disorganized. We can multitask. That's actually really good in a lot of industries, because you hear it all the time, you can't really multitask, nobody can multitask, blah, blah. People with ADHD can, and it makes us brilliant for certain kinds of jobs, you know, like being a surgeon, or you know, working in the theatre where you've got a lot going on, or even being a parent when you've got two little kids going off in different directions and you're trying to buy yogurt. You can do all that at the same time. We're good under pressure. In fact, people with ADHD are so good under pressure that if no pressure exists, we'll create it. And that's one reason we leave things to the last minute. We need the pressure of that deadline looming before we can do anything. Sometimes it's detrimental, but it's just how we work. And we have difficulty finishing anything. So this isn't the prettiest slide in my presentation, I'm fully aware of that, but it does give you an idea of what the ADHD brain looks like. It's messy, stuff is all over the place. It's an irrelevant fact about an octopus, which is true, by the way. Octopuses do have 3 hearts. And I don't know if you noticed, but along the bottom, there was kind of a subplot, a monologue about trying to remember Adam Driver's name. So that's very common with ADHD. We'll be doing one thing and all the time we'll be thinking about something completely irrelevant, and it won't go away until we finally sort of remembered that name or Googled it. So that's ADHD. If you've got your pen and paper, I'd like to do a bit of drawing now. If you've got your pen and paper to hand, I would like you to draw a bat and ball. So I'm just going to give you about a minute to draw a bat and ball, and it doesn't have to be any good. This isn't a drawing competition. So just draw the best you can, and I'll just give you a minute to do that. So has everybody finished their drawing?
Oh,
Yes?
I was going to say, Rachel, someone just asked what we have to draw. So it's a bat and a ball.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. So if everyone's finished drawing, I imagine what you've drawn looks something like this. So this is a table tennis bat and a ping pong ball. You might have drawn a different kind of bat, like a baseball bat or a cricket bat, and a different kind of ball, but you've probably drawn a bat and a ball. And if you've done that, you've done it wrong, because that's not what I said. You heard me say bat and ball, because that makes perfect sense. What I actually said was a bat and a ball, which makes absolutely no sense. And here we've got a picture of a cricket bat and a ball, like the animal, the ball. So if you manage to draw that, you've still got it wrong, because that's not what I meant. I meant a bat, as in the animal, the bat, and a bore, as in a boring person. Now, I told you that you've done it wrong, but it wasn't your fault, was it? It was my fault. I said something that made absolutely no sense, that could easily be mistaken for something that does make sense. And I used words that could be interpreted in different ways. You know, a bat is more than one thing and a bore is more than one thing. But you were told you got it wrong. And that's how it feels to be autistic, because you don't hear what people say when they're not being clear, or they're not making themselves understood correctly, or what they're saying doesn't make any sense to you. Again, autism is another condition which is very hard to put in a nutshell because it's quite complicated. So what I've done is I've used the Maori definition of autism because I really like it. The Maori word, you know, Maoris is in the people who live in New Zealand. Their term for autism literally translates as in their own time and space, which I think is a lovely way of looking at it. And, you know, I sometimes say I live in my own world, which is true, but a lot of people don't really like that stereotype, even though I actually quite like living in my own world because it's not full of opinionated people who try and police my language. But I just think the Maori one is probably a better way of putting it. You've probably heard of the autistic spectrum. A lot of people think it looks like this. So you've got normal at one end, you've got a bit autistic in the middle, and over there you've got Rain Man. When the film Rain Man came out, it was the first time that I'd ever heard the word autistic. But I didn't think that I was autistic because I was nothing like Dustin Hoffman's character in that film. He won an Oscar for that, did you know that? And I thought that was a little bit of a swizz because he hardly had any lines. And to play a stereotypical autistic, you only need one facial expression. So that's possibly something for Nicole Kidman to think about for her next role. The autistic spectrum looks more like this. It's a rainbow. It's a rainbow of colour, and there's all sorts of different things on it. I've just given a few examples here. So you've got rigid thinking or rigid behaviour. You've got crap social skills. Non-verbal happens with some autistic people. Good at maths is very much with the stereotype. Obsessive interests is almost universal, and a lot of autistics are weird about being touched. But that's not all there is to it. Now, I mentioned I've got ADHD. So even though I'm good at maths, it's not apparent because I can't concentrate long enough to do any. What else I said? People cover up their crap social skills by pretending everything is fine. Non-verbal, that can be by choice, choosing not to speak, or it can be not by choice where you just can't, you're not able to speak. Obsessive interest, that suddenly got very big. I personally like Hello Kitty, but it's not an obsession for me, so it exists outside the spectrum in this case. Gastrointestinal issues can be a source of some of that rigid thinking and rigid behaviour. Or it might be nothing to do with that, and it just might be a coexisting condition with autism. About 95% of kids with autism have at least one coexisting condition. Depressions come in there, that runs through it quite often. ADHD can also lead to depression, and depression can be a cause of some of those gastrointestinal issues. Depression also means that you need to be touched, but of course you're weird about being touched unless it's someone on a very specific list that only makes sense to you. Anxiety's come in there now, it's in the wrong font and wrong colour for some reason, and that leads to coping strategies, and depression leads to coping strategies, and ADHD leads to coping strategies, and suddenly pretending everything is fine isn't really working anymore, so you start drinking, and that leads to more depression, and there's a completely irrelevant banana. There's a lot going on. It's a really complicated picture, and it's one reason why autism can be quite hard to diagnose. So why should you care about neurodiversity? Well, there's two reasons. The first is a fluffy one. It's the right thing to do, isn't it? It's a right thing to be inclusive. It's a right thing to be respectful and show understanding. It's also the case that 80% of neurodiverse people are unemployed. So if you are in a position to include neurodiverse people in the workplace, you are part of the solution. The other reason for being inclusive towards neurodiverse people is money. It's the economic benefits, and that's a bit I'm going to go into now in a bit more detail. So the benefits to hiring neurodiverse staff. This is a big one. If there's nothing else that makes you want to hire neurodiverse people, this on its own should convince you. We are 30 to 50% more productive than normal people. And the sources for those figures, the first one comes from the Harvard Business Review, and the second comes from a program that was carried out by JP Chase. One example of this was given to me by Perrine Farrak, and she told me about an autistic man who worked for SAP, you know, the software company. And he reduced a process that was taking 3 days to 20 minutes. So that's just one example of how neurodiverse people are more productive because they find ways of, you know, doing things a bit quicker. I met a dyslexic man as well, who, because he was able to see things so clearly when, you know, when they were in patterns, he was able to write a report in 2 hours that was taking other people a day. One reason for being more productive is because we learn faster. The program that JP Chase did, they were hiring autistic people on a special autistic hiring program, and they were picking things up within 3 to 6 months, and it was taking other people 2 years. So it's much, much faster. I love this one. A lot of people are afraid that hiring neurodiverse people and making those reasonable adjustments that you're legally required to make, it's going to be expensive and it's going to be difficult and blah, blah, blah. But actually, nearly 60% of adaptations for neurodiverse people cost nothing. They're not just cheap, they cost nothing at all. Sometimes it's as simple as offering flexible working or putting a desk by a window like mine is. And even the ones that do cost money can be really cheap. It's the stuff like, you know, noise cancelling headphones, but these are extremely cheap, by the way. But it's not, you're not talking big money here. Universal accommodations benefit everyone. So what that means is when you're offering things to neurodiverse people, everybody in the workplace is benefiting. So let's take flexible working as an example of that. You offer it to people with ADHD or autism because for some reason they work better at night. They're more creative at night, say, so they just want to work weird hours and it's not going to affect anyone else, so that's cool. But then you offer flexible working to everyone else and suddenly the working parents are happier. Or the people with a chronic illness are working better because they can work around their appointments. Or somebody with elderly parents who's got to drive them to the hospital at 10 o'clock on a Tuesday morning and make up the time later is suddenly happier because it just makes their life easier. So everybody benefits. Neurodiverse staff will understand your neurodiverse clients better, which is great because there's going to be a proportion of your clients or your customers who are going to be neurodiverse anyway. If you're in a particular industry, that's going to be higher than average. So if you are working with people in IT, for example, or, you know, which has a lot of autistic people, or you're working in the arts, or you're working in, you know, something where you are going to find a lot of dyslexic people, that the visual arts is one area where there's a lot of dyslexics. If you're working in those fields, if you're selling to those people, your neurodiverse staff are going to be able to understand those clients a lot better. And finally, inclusive workplaces have lower staff absence, higher performance, better collaboration and more innovation, and that results in increased revenue. There's actual statistics on that, and those are all from the Chartered Institute of Personal Development. So yeah, lots and lots of reasons for hiring neurodiverse people. So you know what neurodiversity is now, and you know why it's important, but how do we start including neurodiverse people? How do we do that in the workplace, and how do we do it right? I'm going to tell you in three steps. The first one is to rethink the rule book. This picture is an actual business book. The picture's a little bit weird because I took it myself a while ago. I was in a chocolate factory in York, and they wouldn't let me near the chocolate with good reason, because I would have gone through the lot of it. So I was put in the back where the library was. And of course, because it's a chocolate factory, they had this book by Benjamin Seaborn Roundtree, who ran a chocolate factory in York. You know Roundtree's chocolates, right? And Roundtree's fruit pastels and so on. He was one of the pioneers of new working practices. He actually cared about his employees, and that was what made him successful. So he wrote this book nearly 100 years ago, and we're still not on board with some of the things that he was talking about in this book. Some of the working practices, you know, listening to your employees, understanding your employees. He was one of the first people to start assigning people to jobs according to what they were good at, which is what we try and do with neurodiverse people. And he was, you know, he wrote a new book. He started doing things in new ways, and some people still haven't caught up yet. And what I mean about us rethinking the rule book now, I understand that it can be a little bit challenging, and it can be quite hard to get people on board when you're looking at your rule book for how to recruit people, how to recruit and maintain, retain staff, because the old ways don't really work for neurodiverse people. If you're trying to get them into your organisation, asking people to fill in a form is not going to get dyslexics in. Asking people to come to an interview is not necessarily going to work for people, or they're not going to do very well in that interview just because it's not the right environment for them. So we need to be rethinking our whole recruitment and retention processes in order to get the neurodiverse people through the door in the first place. Secondly, don't set it and forget it. Neurodiverse people are not a slow cooker. That means once you've got people into your organisation, you can't just sort of leave them to get on with it. We need to keep checking in, making sure those, you know, the reasonable adaptations are still working for them. What do they need? Anything else? How is the team working? What's going on when they have, you know, a change in the team that they work with? If new people come, if people leave, if you get another neurodiverse person in, because you are allowed 2 at once, or more than that. You're allowed more than one. And you need to keep doing that. And if there's any lawyers in this group, that's not just to avoid litigation, because that's something that lawyers do worry about. You do have a legal responsibility to make reasonable adjustments for neurodiverse staff, but it's not just about that. It's also about the fact that if you keep, you know, if you're invested in that person's professional development, you get so much more out of them. I've shown you already how productive we are and how we learn faster. Put in the right environment, we can really build on our strengths. So you're getting a better employee for every little change that you make. And the third thing is to tailor your approach. I don't know how many people will get that joke. That's Taylor Swift in a tailor suit. I know it's not very good, but you know, Taylor. Yeah, tailoring your approach. I already said that every neurodiverse person is different, but so is your organisation. So are the people in your organisation, and so are you. So having a one-size-fits-all approach doesn't really work effectively. You need to be tailoring everything to the way you work, the way you want to work, because this is about you as well, and the neurodiverse people that you want to employ, that you want to include. So, what have you learnt in today's workshop? Well, first of all, you've learnt what neurodiversity is. Secondly, you've learnt why you should care about it. And thirdly, you've learnt how to include neurodiverse people in your organisation. But there's one more thing, the secret sauce. None of what I have said today matters unless you've got the right attitude. none of this stuff is going to work unless you really want to include neurodiverse people, unless you're committed to being inclusive and accessible and wanting to understand us and wanting to learn about, what drives us and so on. You have to have that positive and open-minded attitude. And there's something else about that as well. You've already got it, because you've come to this workshop. You've already shown that you are streets ahead of people who are not even interested in learning about this stuff. You've got it in you to be able to do everything else, because you've got that attitude. And it means, that sort of thing, being inclusive, means a lot to anyone. But for people like me, it means something else, because neurodiverse people have always been excluded. We've always been left out. We've always been told that we're a problem, or we're a challenge, or we need to be managed, and so on. So when you come to us with that positive attitude, that open mind, and that willingness to listen to us and to include us, it really means a lot to us. It means more to us than to other people. And so for that, and to close, I just want to say thank you very much.
Wonderful, Rachel. Firstly, I just want to say thank you so much. I feel like I've learned so much just from that short time. And I feel like we've barely scratched the surface, and I personally just want to sit you down now and ask you a million questions. But I'm going to go through some of the questions that we've had from the audience.
Okay. Sorry, can I just let people know how to get, if they don't want to ask now, they can get in touch with me afterwards if they wish. So my details are up here on this last slide. I'm going to stop sharing in a minute. So my website is sparkleclass.com, and please do connect with me on LinkedIn. My name is Rachel Morgan Trimmer. I'm the only one there. And the only Rachel Morgan Trimmer. I'm not the only person on LinkedIn. And my Twitter handle is sparkleclass. So, and I think you're going to be sending that out afterwards as well. And I just want to give a quick thank you to my contributors to this workshop, because obviously I don't have all the conditions, and I have had some first-hand information on that from some of my colleagues. So they're listed at the bottom there.
Awesome.
Thank you.
We will also be sharing Rachel's contact details after this event as well. So if you didn't get a chance to write it down, we'll be emailing that out to you directly. So to the Q&A then, Rachel, Holly Ann Dame had a really good question. She talked about how she found working from home during COVID, that HR managers, she felt almost forgotten, and she felt that they'd forgotten about neurodiverse employees. And her question is, how can we help employers consider how changing roles or environments impact people so they don't set it and forget it?
That's a really good question. I actually wrote an article on LinkedIn about how employers can manage neurodiverse employees who are working remotely. So if you have a look at that, that will, and send it obviously to your boss, that would help. I think what's really key is that communication, because people don't always like to ask for what they need, and they don't always want to, people don't always want to offer. Sometimes managers don't want to offer stuff because they don't want to seem patronizing or whatever. So I think it's having an open conversation, an open two-way conversation. If you know what you need, saying the benefits to the company can really help. So you say, if I was able to work this hour and this hour, I don't think it would impact on that, and I would be able to do so much more. For example, I tend to work very early. I start my working day before the kids get up, because it's the quietest day, the quietest hour of the year. So if you're able to explain that and have that communication, I think that can go a long way to to helping your manager understand why you need these things. Because if you say stuff and without explaining why you need it, I think people don't always understand. And a lot of people don't understand some of the weird stuff that that neurodiverse people have. We do have some ways of doing things that other people don't really get, and I think if you explain it, that can really help.
Wonderful. So moving on to the next question, what sort of changes can we make in the company interview process to accommodate the needs of neurodiverse people?
What changes can you make in the company to accommodate the needs of neurodiverse people?
The company interview process specifically.
Thank you. Well, some people don't do interviews anymore. There are two companies in Manchester who I've spoken to about this. One is Excelsis, it's based in Manchester, and the other is Inevitable. They don't always do interviews. In fact, Excelsis never does. They do placements instead, because the guy who runs Excelsis, he doesn't think interviews are actually productive. You don't get to see what somebody is like, really, in an interview. And we all know that because we're all on our best behaviour, aren't we? And they have a screening process instead, so they can see before people come in if they're going to be a good fit and so on. They have separate screeners, and then they just get people in and see how they work on a trial placement, and that, you know, that enables you to see if they can work with the team, and if they can work with you, and if they can do the work and so on, and they get paid for it as well. And he actually said it normally works. It doesn't work every single time, but then neither do interviews. So that's one way.
Awesome. Really good question here. How do you think employers should let staff and prospective employees know that it is safe to openly declare their condition?
That is a very good question. Can you tell me who asked that? Because I know some of the people here.
Gareth Williams.
Hi, Gareth. Yeah, I do know him. That is a really interesting question. And I went to Gareth's event the other day, and I know why he's asking, because he mentioned disclosure in a different event. It's a very good question, and it's something that people consider very carefully, because I would love it if we were in a world where people could disclose openly and it wouldn't be a big deal. We're not there yet. That's the truth of the matter, and it is unfortunate, but you need to be able to protect your own job first of all, because it's quite easy to say, you know, it's going to be fine, whatever, but if you're relying on your job, it's not that easy. That's not the real world. Disclosure is incredibly personal, and I think, can you remind, sorry, I'm not very good at questions, can you remind me what he said again, what specifically he asked?
How do you think employers should let staff and prospective employees know that it is safe to openly declare their condition?
So how should employees know that they are safe to declare their condition? I think, again, this open communication, having these open conversations about it. Anyone in a leadership position disclosing really, really helps, because, you know, if you're in a hierarchical organisation that the people at the top are saying, I've got this, I've got that, that can really, really help. And I think maybe one way would be to offer those adaptations without asking people what they have. So if you were going to say offer text-to-speech and speech-to-text software, which a lot of dyslexics like to use, you can just say to everyone in the company, this is available for whoever wants it, without somebody saying, actually, I'm dyslexic. You can just say, here is the software that you can use. So that's one way of doing it. And thanks for a fun question, Gareth.
There's another question actually talking about the tech. Are there any tools or products that you're aware of for collaborative working that you can suggest when considering supporting neurodiverse talent and colleagues?
Yeah, I have done a bit of stuff with AOA, that's spelled AYOA. They make products for neurodiverse people, and they're really pretty as well, which is quite important to some of us, like mind mapping software, collaborative software, and so on. It's AOA.com. They run that, and they're big into neurodiversity. They work with a lot of neurodiverse people to develop this stuff. And there's a dyslexia one called Claro Software, that's CLARO. They're based in Manchester, actually. They do a lot of dyslexia stuff, and they've got some free stuff that's on till the end of September. I don't use that stuff myself, because do you know what, I'm so old school, and like a lot of people with ADHD, I actually use a lot of pen and paper. But those are two that I know of that are neurodiverse specific.
Fantastic, Rachel, thank you. Another question, do you know the numbers behind diagnosis, i.e. if there's a big number of people that perhaps go through undiagnosed for their whole life?
Obviously that's not a number we can count, because it's a number of we don't know. Anecdotal evidence suggests that it is a big number. It gets bigger the older you get, because obviously a lot of the diagnosis, you know, there wasn't, when I was at school, there wasn't ADHD, and there, you know, autism, again, it was just Rain Man and that was it. So you tend to see it more and more in people over 40, over 50, over 60. And women tend to go undiagnosed with ADHD and autism because we don't fit the standard diagnostic criteria which were developed with males. And you find even with this, you think dyslexia would get picked up. I spoke to someone, in fact, someone who helped me out with this workshop, and I said to him, do you think you're dyslexic? He's in his 40s, and he was like, oh, I don't know. And then he spent an hour researching it and came back and said, oh, yeah, I think I am actually. So even dyslexia can go undiagnosed. And also, it's not just underdiagnosis, it's misdiagnosis as well. And that can be a problem for some people. And that is something that affects Black people in particularly young Black boys tend to get misdiagnosed. You will find that Black boys with autism are more likely to be diagnosed with a learning disability. And Black boys with ADHD are more likely to be diagnosed with behavioural disorders. So there's obviously a big problem there with, with gender and race issues when it comes to both underdiagnosis and misdiagnosis. And one of the things that obviously that we're trying to do now is talk about it more, because every week I meet someone who says, every time I do one of these talks, I have someone coming up to me afterwards saying, I think I might have a bit of that ADHD. I think the guy I know might be autistic, and they're usually right.
Next question, another really good one actually. When companies are looking to employ ND people, what are your thoughts about the employees having a profile that clearly stipulates their ND traits and needs?
Can you just clarify that? Hang on, I'm going to see if I can see it in the questions. I don't know if you mean the when you say their needs.
So this question is from.
Hang on, I found it.
Can you see it?
Yeah. Oh, so you're asking if the employee has a profile that stipulates their ND traits and needs, and how to ensure other staff are able to adapt to these, and how to handle situations that are outside of their known area, such as excessive stimming. That's a really good question, because for some people it's not the easiest thing to adapt to a neurodiverse employee who is quite obvious, who does things that person, the neurotypical person, might not be used to, or even some neurodiverse people may not be used to it. Yeah, I think, again, it's a question of disclosure. If the potential employee or the employee wants to disclose, that is their choice. And in terms of having other staff adapt, I think, again, that open communication, understanding why things are going on and what's happening and why people are doing stuff can help, but also staff training can get to a lot of those points. Because, for example, if you talk about stimming, and in my training sessions, if I talk about stimming, I point out that everyone stims. Half of you are going to be doing this with a pen or fiddling with your earphones or your hair while we're doing this. Everyone stims. Autistic people do it to a greater extent. I do it because I'm older and late diagnosed. I tend to mask it more, so I tend to chew my pen, which is socially acceptable. So, we try and go through all things like this to say it's not like autistics are doing a weird thing or this person's doing a weird thing. It's more like everyone does stuff. We all have ways of coping with our environment. We all need adaptations. Neurodiverse people might need different ones, but that doesn't mean they're weird or wrong. I hope that answers your question. I think it was from Nadia, wasn't it? Thank you. Yes,
that's correct. Another question, do you think the misdiagnosis and underdiagnosis among minority groups is also because they present slightly differently, like female autism traits being slightly different to males?
That is definitely the case with women. With the race thing, I can't really comment on that because it's not an area that's very well researched, unfortunately. With women, definitely. Women mask. Masking is where you suppress your neurodiverse traits in order to fit in, especially in cases of autism. And you don't tend to know that you're doing it. Women are culturally conditioned to fit in and be nice. And I've got this pet theory about why female autistics in particular are undiagnosed. It's because we're not a problem. So if you've got somebody with ADHD or boys autism, they're going to be bouncing around the classroom, or they're going to be spending all their time and money tinkering with their car or collecting action figures. And that's not productive and it's not helping anyone. But with women, if you sit quietly, no one cares. You're sitting quietly because you don't know how to talk to people. So if you put me in a pub with a group of neurotypical people I'm not going to join in because I don't know how to, and nobody cares because no one, whereas an autistic male might talk a lot, and that is a problem, and that's what people notice because they don't necessarily like it. And autistic women's interests tend to be productive again. So mine is cooking. I've got a sponge cake recipe in this talk. This talk's something to do with sponge cake, but there's a recipe in it because I'm obsessed with food. And again, that's not a problem, is it? No one says, please stop making me cakes. Please stop cooking for me. And again, with knitting as well, there's no such thing as too much knitting. And I think one of the issues is that because women's stereotypical female interests are not a problem, people don't tend to pick up on it as much. And that was a very good question, so thank you for that.
So another question, do you have any recommendations as to how you as a neurodiverse person can communicate your needs in a constructive way?
That is a good question. Do you know what? This took me a really long time to get to that point where I can do that. So that is a very important question. It's not always easy, and I don't know, do you know who asked that question?
Sarah Bengston.
Okay, I don't know how old Sarah is, but if you've spent a long time not asking for stuff, which I have, it's harder to make that change, to start asking for things. I think being respectful is important because we ask neurodiverse people, we ask people to be respectful to us and to communicate openly. We also have to do that to other people. So when we are asking for what we need, it's important to do that in a respectful manner and to also respect that it might be difficult for someone else to provide that at that time. We're not, we are special, but we have to respect that other people have needs. I think being respectful and being honest, and again, like with the jobs thing, explaining why you need something can be really helpful because otherwise people just don't understand. Because in my house, for example, I don't like stuff being left on the floor, and and I ask people to tidy up and they don't really care or they don't really understand. But when I say I want you to tidy up because I'm afraid I'll trip on it and hurt myself, then they get it and then they'll do it. So I think if you go to the end result of what that's going to do, it can really help communicate why you need those things.
Kind of moving on quite nicely actually from that question, Emily Wenzel had a question. Emily says, autistic here, misdiagnosed with loads of things, finally diagnosed at 32. Since I've started disclosing, a constant issue that I have is a lack of belief by my colleagues and management that I need adjustments because I mask so effectively. It's resulted in some very unwelcome comments and makes me feel reluctant to ask for help. Any tips on how to deal with this?
Okay, well, first of all, Emily is not alone. Unfortunately, there are people who do understand how you feel about that, Emily, and I know it's frustrating, and I know it's difficult because you're masking so well. Someone told me this week that I was fine. You look fine. It's annoying, and I don't know if Emily has any kind of documentation because some people don't believe. She's saying people don't believe her. If she's got some backup in the form of some kind of medical thing or whatever, it can really help. Even stuff, from somewhere like the National Autistic website, printed off to just help support her case that she needs that. And if she's got someone sympathetic at work that she can go to, starting off with the best person who's going to listen to you first and start working your way through that might be really helpful because you're going to have to start with the person who's going to be most responsive to you, and then you can start, people are going to start understanding very, very slowly. And also some training in the workplace for that company might be useful because then they will learn to understand all of this stuff a little bit better.
These questions are amazing. One more around role design. So any thoughts on best practice with helping employers understand the need for role design to minimise weaknesses and play to strengths?
To clarify, does role design mean when you design the job around the person?
I would take that as when you build a job description for a vacancy. Unfortunately, the questioner is anonymous, so we can't ask directly.
Okay. So what are my thoughts about role design? So designing the job around the person. That is really good. And the most successful employers who have neurodiverse people who are thriving are finding that it's really working for them, because some people will, some autistics don't want to work face to face with the public. Some people are brilliant at it, and so they'll ask to do the job without that aspect and to do something else instead. And Theo Smith, who works at NICE here in Manchester, he is neurodiverse, and he's a massive advocate of neurodiverse recruitment. And he told me when he had someone he'd come to talk about a job or whatever, when they said they could adapt the job to him, he said the guy's face actually lit up, because it was the first time that this guy had had that kind of opportunity where somebody had said to him, we get that you're autistic, it's not a problem, we'll design the job around you, it's going to be cool. And he said you could actually see it. And when you've got people like that in your organisation who are so pleased to be there, they're going to be doing their best work. So I think designing the job around people's needs can be really effective, and people are proving that it works. I hope that answers the question. I've kind of forgot what it was because it was a bit ago.
It felt like it did for me. And if whoever it was that asked that wants to re-clarify, then feel free to jump back into the Q&A. Another question from Ian. Rachel, I picked up earlier, you said you get up before the children because it's the quietest time of year. Assume day is what you meant. Have you struggled with finding the correct choice of words? Have you any examples of when this has caused a problem as you were misunderstood? And how do you approach explaining what it is you meant?
That is a really good question, and good for Ian for picking that up, by the way. He, I don't know if he's autistic or not, but picking up on those details is quite an autistic thing to do. I said year, and then I think I corrected myself to hour, didn't I? But yeah, I realised what I said. I do that quite a lot. It sometimes makes these presentations a little bit difficult because I trip over my words, as you can see, and I sometimes say the wrong word, and I have been misunderstood. And most of the time it hasn't been serious, but it is something that I'm quite aware of, and it's quite it can be quite embarrassing because I do muddle up my words a lot, or I say stupid stuff. I posted on Twitter the other day that I said to my husband, what was that book by Ernest Hemingway? It was about an old man and the sea. And then I realised what I said. The book's called The Old Man and the Sea, and but I cope with it now by laughing about it because it is funny, and I'm quite lighthearted about this sort of thing, with my Space Cadet t-shirt and so on. And it's not just a coping mechanism, it is actually genuinely funny, some of the stuff I come out with.
Wonderful. And then we have a question from Mathia. I hope I'm saying your name correctly there. What a lovely and practical webinar. It's brightened my heart. I am a medical doctor, a psychiatric resident, and 28 years old. Also, I have ADHD. Have you any tips how to manage my ADHD beside my profession? I'm always afraid my ADHD affects my patients.
That's an interesting question. I imagine that the ADHD manifests itself in different ways at different times in the work. It's going to be different when they're talking to someone, and I don't know if it's the same for the questioner as for me, but when I'm talking one-to-one with a client with ADHD, I can focus and I can engage. And I know from talking to other neurodiverse psychiatrists in particular, some of the issues can be with the notes that you have to write down, or some of that organisation and management around it. There are lots of strategies that you can use to manage those things. I think it's really lovely that the questions come from the point of it affecting the patients. You obviously care about what you do a great deal, which is lovely, and I think that alone is going to help you because you're coming from a point where you care about stuff. And for all neurodiverse people, if we care about a thing, we will find a way of managing it and dealing with it, because if things have meaning for us, that's where we do our best work.
And unfortunately, we're out of time there. There's still a few more questions to get through, but we will be sharing Rachel's contact details, and Rachel's happy to receive that communication directly. I would like to say, firstly, a huge thank you, Rachel, for educating me personally. The chat has been blowing up the whole way through, with people virtually nodding their head, agreeing and feeling safe enough to say that, that putting their hand up and saying that's me. You're describing exactly how people feel and who they are. And I think that's really incredible to do virtually. So I cannot thank you enough personally from Spinks and Computer Weekly for setting the bar really high for all our workshops, for actually educating and for teaching us some practical tips and giving us some practical advice. It feels like the most interactive workshop I've been to for a really long time. So thank you very, very much. As I said, we'll send around Rachel's information, and we'll also forward around the link to the Diversity Conference on the 1st of October. But Rachel, thank you again. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you very much. And thank you all very much for coming.